Okay, this is Amina Akosa. We're in Dr. Lord's office. Dr. Lord is beside me. He's an entomologist here at LSU. And to the left of me is
Brianna Turnbull.
Next to her is Joey Bashaw.
Honeybees are obviously critically important because they pollinate the vast majority of crops around the world. The honeybee itself is actually an import from Europe here in the United States. So measuring diversity, and that's sort of what I do as a taxonomist, is fairly difficult because you have to first have some idea of what's out there. And there are so many millions of insect species that can be quite hard to do. And so then when you think that there's a problem, something humanistic that's impacting negatively diversity, you sort of need to go back to the basics of let's measure what diversity is out there, let's measure rates of diversity increase or decrease, and then let's look at what consequences that might have.
As I meant to ask, can you describe more about your research that you're doing now with beetles?
Sure, yeah. So I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology here at LSU, and I am also the director of the Louisiana State Arthropod Museum. My basic goal is to travel around the world and describe biodiversity and name new species and things like that. So here at LSU, it's transitioned more towards me trying to understand the evolution of color and vision in insects. And so I work on this very pretty group called the jewel beetles.
These bees, like they have, and I keep saying bees, but like the specific bees that were in the study were, and I might pronounce this really wrong, but Osmia biscornis. And they studied the bee fitness by the chemical element available. So monocultures don't provide the necessary elements that they need. And so they just studied about like deficiencies, and you had to focus on the different sexes and like what they need from elements. So it's really important to dig deeper into these.
When you're talking about decline in honeybee health, it's one of these problems globally that we would love to reduce down to being caused by just a few issues. But oftentimes, because this is a living organism, a dynamic ecosystem, there are lots of different variables at play. So for example, right now with the honeybees, there are, obviously you see lots of initiatives where we're realizing that, yeah, even though nice manicured medians on highways might look good to us, those are essentially a different monoculture of grass. And you're seeing a lot of initiatives to return some of these more manicured landscaped areas to native pollination. And the reason you want to do that is just like you've mentioned, we don't eat the same foods every day diet. So yeah, and then there are obviously a few other specific problems hurting the bees right now. One of them is a specific type of mite that's a parasite on these bees. There's actually a beetle called a small hive beetle that is found almost in any bee hive you pull now from a commercial or a hobbyist beekeeper.
You guys ever studied the stress level of these beetles?
Yeah, and so we've got a couple of projects on beetles and in bees right now. So what we're specifically looking at is the impacts that viruses that bees have, how that alters their ability to forage effectively. So if you think about it, even if we created an ideal ecosystem where we had a diversity of plants and flowers, even if the bees themselves were healthy colonies and they were not exposed to residual pesticides, things like that, so it sort of this ideal. We're seeing that bees are still relatively unhealthy, and there are a handful of viruses. Deformed wing virus, or DWV, is one of them. What we're finding is that it is almost impossible to sample colonies anywhere in North America that don't have at least extremely low levels of this virus present in the colony. Why that's a big deal is because it's essentially present everywhere. It's sort of like COVID now, right? You're not going to find a place that has not had COVID. It's gone through. Because bees, hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of individual members live in a single super colony, if one bee comes back infected, it goes through the entire colony very quickly. But just like us, we've obviously got lots of viruses and bacteria within each of us right now. They don't normally cause a problem at low levels. Our natural immune systems keep them in check. But what we're finding is if there are enough of these different types of viruses in these bees, even if they're not at the individual levels of causing deformed wings or paralysis, that these latent or secondary viruses, low levels, are causing impacts on critical bee functioning in the first place.
When I was doing my research, it actually came up that beekeeping isn't as progressive as it should be when it comes to keeping biodiversity. And do you have anything to say about beekeeping and how that might affect?
Sure. Yeah. I think you're sort of getting at where we're fighting society versus as humans versus the natural world. So again, it's the age-old debate of what should we be doing in a natural sense versus what do we want to do because we can.
I think you mentioned earlier too about just expanding those polycultures. In my research, it was talking more about how our idea of this urban area and then this countryside area, you might be like, oh, well, we need to plant all these different crops here in this countryside, but bees obviously don't know the difference between an urban and countryside, so it's important to implement that in all areas.
In elementary school, I remember learning about like saving the bees and how it's like so important, but they never really taught us what exactly goes into that. It was just bees are important and this is why. So it's really interesting to see like how complicated the issue really is.
So I think that the biggest thing would just be about voting for more restrictions on bees.
Yeah, so a lot of that is, you're right, it's understanding the regulations behind pesticides and toxic chemicals. It's also how much science is supported. You know, if we're unable to fully study these questions, then we might sort of be left in the dark as to how big the problem is and how we might go about fixing it.
All right, well that wraps it up, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.